civilian casualties since the start of NATO's attacks. But why? There's a military barracks about half a mile away, he says, maybe more. But why hit us? We're not a target. They could find no answers to that on this night of heavy NATO strikes, when Serbs here felt suffering and pain. Brent Sadler, CNN, Aleksinac, Yugoslavia.
No, it is a closed operational base. It's NATO's biggest airfield involved in this operation, and as such we are not allowed beyond the perimeter fence. All I can say is that with a little under half an hour to go before that the Serbian unilateral ceasefire comes into effect, there is no indication here at the end of the main runway that there will be any change in what has been the operational picture here, certainly for the last 2 days when clearing skies have allowed NATO's warplanes to fly day and night. This time of evening is about when the main early evening offensive gets underway, and at this time yesterday we were seeing warplanes taking off within 20 seconds of each other, the F-15s, F-16s, the A-10s, their weapons pods loaded, their wingtips bristling with weapons, and that's certainly from the activity that we can see just behind, and I can hear the sound of jet engines warming up, is what we're expecting. So as we were hearing from the White House, and as all the sources within the alliance are indicating, no let-up in what the Allies are seeing now as an air offensive which is starting to gain the upper hand after the setbacks of the bad weather in the first 2 weeks. So it will certainly go into its third week overnight with a renewed and certainly not an undiminished effort.
Well, NATO is not going to stop its airstrikes just when it looks as though they're beginning to succeed. This is another crack in the wall of obstinacy that Milosevic has put up. It's another indication that we're beginning to hurt the military machine that he's used so ruthlessly in the past few weeks against the people of Kosovo. But it's not evidence of sincerity. It's not a clear indication that he's going to change his behavior yet. And when he does, and when we're satisfied he's going to withdraw his troops, allow an international peacekeeping force led by NATO in there to get people back in safety, and when he stopped the violence permanently, then the bombing will stop too.
Format now, these are looking through what the pilot would see. The aircraft operate together in pairs. One of them targets, the other one drops the bomb. You can see the target right in the center there in a box. And this is using white heat by the look of it. The thermal imaging camera gives you either white or black for heat. There's the explosion going off. What you always look for is to see the secondary explosion to make sure that it's hit a worthwhile target, something it has ammunition in. And of course these are military targets. These are not civilian targets that they're looking for on these.
And that was followed up with tornadoes. Do they fly together often like that?
Well, they don't. It's an interesting operation. We don't know a lot of the details yet, but we understand that there were a lot of activity from the tornadoes. They've been flying from RAF Bruggen in Germany. It's the first time since 1945 that RAF bomber aircraft have departed their home base, and Germany's been their home base for 50 years, against targets in enemy territory. So the RAF are sort of saying that this is a bit reminiscent of the Second World War in a way. And the RAF was showing today how they tank from DC-10 tankers. They take fuel on board in the Mediterranean and then again on the way back across the Adriatic. So a lot of very interesting activity. Carriers. This is the Theodore Roosevelt, and it's got 47 strike aircraft on. The Hornets there, the new version of the Hornets, the CD version of the Hornets, and the Tomcat fighter, the aircraft from Top Gun. And these aircraft are capable of delivering a range of munitions, cluster weapons, precision-guided bombs, etc., right the way across. That's a Marines aircraft because the Navy and the US Marines both operate off the aircraft carriers. And this is an extra formidable punch now for NATO.
Extraordinary number of aircraft, but can this campaign actually... NATO has promised the airstrikes will be undiminished, unrelenting and unceasing.
We'll both be back with Sky News at 10 when we'll go live to Washington, Macedonia and Downing Street. What could be the heaviest night of bombing so far?
This was NATO's response to the Yugoslav ceasefire. Western leaders do not see this as an olive branch. They think that Slobodan Milosevic believes his job is done in Kosovo that enough are dead or have fled for no further action to be necessary. Global reaction was swift.
Whether it's permanent or temporary, it's not sufficient. It does not meet the demands that the President, the Secretary of State, and NATO have laid down.
I think this just gets added to one of the many Milosevic-type offers that have been made in the past and litter the Balkans in the bloodshed.
Russia and the Vatican seem alone in welcoming the announcement, which came at 4 p.m. London time on Serbian television.
Peace can be stabilized, refugees return, and autonomy may be restored. Equality of citizens and national communities should be improved, and basis for permanent solution achieved.
This is what Slobodan Milosevic has said. Now that they've stopped fighting, my troops will leave when the bombing ends. Refugees will be welcomed back, and talks on Kosovo autonomy can begin. NATO's reply, withdraw now or we won't stop the bombing. Allow the refugees back, and let a peacekeeping force protect them. Today, Serbian television showed pictures of the Second World War and likened the bombardment of Belgrade to the German attacks exactly 58 years ago. The bombing of 1999 is more intense now than at any time since the campaign began. Today, more than 120 warplanes left their bases in Italy.
Our government made a decision to promote a unilateral ceasefire, and after that immediately to call up all refugees, Albanian refugees from Albania, from Macedonia, Montenegro, from the other parts of Serbia to come back to Kosovo.
But missions are continuing and they'll be more frequent. NATO believes the ceasefire was declared as a ploy to buy time and hopefully divide the alliance. Those fighting Slobodan Milosevic insist their resolve is unchanged. David Foster, Sky News.
Well,
Wild in the makeshift camps. This woman was taken away from the area with suspected hepatitis.
There's an understandable feeling of distrust among the refugees. They continue to flee despite news of the ceasefire. But even if peace was to come to Kosovo, it would take a massive effort to repatriate this battered nation. Ross Appleyard, Sky News, Albania.
Tensions in Montenegro have...
General Wesley Clark is in charge of a campaign that is not exactly going to plan.
Thank you very much. Let's shape out. Thank you.
We were given special permission to film inside this morning's high-level briefing. Video links connected the commanders in and around the Balkans. This operation may have the best technology, but there is a feeling here, conveyed only privately, that it's not NATO that's making the running, but Mr. Milosevic. In public, of course, the line remains upbeat.
We never thought we could fight a ground war from the air, but we do know that we're making him pay a heck of a price for the terrible things that are going on in there, and we intend to continue it and intensify it.
But who has the initiative, you or Milosevic?
Well, I think very clearly from the air side we have the initiative.
But nothing is quite that simple, as the RAF's Harrier pilots are finding out. Armed with cluster bombs, they've been sent to attack the Serbs' tanks in Kosovo, the central part of the NATO campaign. The weather is clear for bombing now, but the Serbs have suddenly become elusive. They've spread their forces out over Kosovo and are hiding them in and amongst buildings, and also under camouflage, where the tanks are kept static, much more than usual, so they're saving the fuel which NATO is trying to starve them of. They maintain radio silence to be harder to track, and not using their engines means there's no heat for NATO's infrared cameras to pick up. At the NATO news briefing today, commanders admitted to us that they faced frustrating problems.
Despite the good weather, we did have problems actually seeing the targets and being able to get them on the ground. It is a very cunning enemy out there.
It was here in the heart of NATO's military headquarters that the original war plan was drawn up, but it's clear that that's now been overtaken by events on the ground. NATO's having to operate suddenly on two fronts, military and humanitarian. And it's here that NATO's having to come up with a new plan, but that's far from easy. As one senior official put it, there's a vacuum of thinking about the next stage in this crisis. David Truckman, BBC News at NATO's military headquarters in Belgium.
Thanks, Judy. First of all, explosions reported in areas around Belgrade, and our colleagues in Podgorica, Montenegro, report explosions there also. We await more details on those. Let's go back to this offer of a deal from the Yugoslav authorities here. The announcement of a unilateral ceasefire was broadcast several hours ago on Serbian television. Belgrade declaring its army and police would stop fighting in Kosovo as of about 4 hours ago. Said to be a gesture of goodwill to mark Orthodox Easter this Sunday. But the validity of Belgrade's new military stance in Kosovo is difficult, if not impossible, to verify, given the absence of an international presence on the ground. The Yugoslav statement also offered to forge a temporary agreement with ethnic Albanian leader Ibrahim Rugova and to allow a return of refugees with the help of international relief organizations, providing bombing stops, and there's no independence for Kosovo, and that no NATO-led troops are allowed inside Serbia to enforce any agreement. Well, earlier this evening, air raid sirens were heard in the Yugoslav capital as hundreds of people were seen linking arms across one of the bridges over the rivers here in the Yugoslav capital. This has been a pattern over the last couple of nights. People here in Belgrade concerned that NATO may switch their attacks against river links over the rivers Danube and Sava. Well, the apparent shift in Yugoslav strategy came after NATO warplanes carried out one of the most intensive series of strikes against Yugoslavia seen so far, including yet another attack overnight on links across the river Danube at Novi Sad, Yugoslavia's second largest city. Novi Sad's third and final bridge was badly damaged, but it still stands. In addition to roads, bridges and rail links, Allied warplanes blasted fuel depots and oil refineries. Meanwhile, in the southern Serbian town of Aleksinac, a NATO strike appeared to inflict the heaviest civilian casualties seen here so far. Reports that 7 people were killed are circulating in the village tonight after 2 massive explosions in the center of that community. Many other people were...
Not just an end to the brutality would be needed for the bombers to be called off. Yugoslav government ministers met in Belgrade, announcing there would also be a partial withdrawal of their forces if the NATO attack stopped. But the Serb offer is being regarded with open contempt.
It is a pretty cynical ploy on the brink of the Orthodox Easter for this to come, and pretty cynical for those who have been tossed across the borders. We'll judge them by deeds and not by words, and we'll expect much more than this offer.
The Defence Secretary also revealed that RAF Harriers are now bombing targets directly linked to the atrocities, including today a convoy of military vehicles. The diplomatic moves in Belgrade are being seen as a sign of a regime thrown onto the defensive. But evidence of the Serb brutality is still visible, villages being torched, and there is tonight no sign of an end to the military offensive that has so ravaged Kosovo.
Theodore Roosevelt take off today for airstrikes against Serb forces in Kosovo. With NATO warplanes from Aviano, Italy, they're the most intensive airstrikes yet. Gun camera footage shows NATO attacks on Serb fuel depots overnight, 30 different targets in the past 24 hours. Now, after 2 weeks of airstrikes, intelligence officials report that constant bombing is beginning to grind down the Serb military, that some units are beginning to run low on fuel, ammo, and morale. The Pentagon claims that may be why Milosevic is suddenly willing to talk peace.
This offer may be one sign that he's rattled, but we're going to continue to rattle him until he makes an offer that meets our conditions, and he's far away from that right now.
Meanwhile, still more chaos in Kosovo as tens of thousands of refugees crowd the border into Macedonia, where camp conditions are becoming more unlivable by the day.
We are living here like animals.
But at the U.S. military camp in Aviano today, the Pentagon's Joint Chiefs Chairman Hugh Shelton pledges American airstrikes will not stop until they finish the job.
And that'll be to continue to reduce Milosevic's capabilities. He'll get weaker by the day.
But U.S. military police and paramilitaries. At that point, NATO says ground troops must be allowed in to protect returning refugees, and Milosevic must accept political autonomy for Kosovo. After the president's national security team met at the White House this afternoon, a senior U.S. official said NATO's bombing campaign would stop if those Serb forces are withdrawn, and Milosevic indicates he's prepared to accept ground troops. The latest NBC News Wall Street...
A committee of nations. More on that tonight from NBC's Andrea Mitchell.
The U.S. has said no to the ceasefire offer, but will the other NATO allies break ranks? Tonight, the U.S. is so worried Defense Secretary Bill Cohn is heading to NATO headquarters. NBC News has learned several NATO countries sympathetic to Milosevic even wanted to accept his offer today.
Some of the Europeans who are already very uncomfortable with this bombing may start seizing on any offer of his as an opportunity to stop.
Why are allies sympathetic to Serbia? Italy, only 150 miles from Yugoslavia, fears Serb retaliation and a flood of refugees. Greece shares Serbia's religion. Hungary has 350,000 ethnic Hungarians in Serbia. NATO sources say their objections have slowed the air war from day one, the result of fighting a war by committee.
One can look at the selection of targets in Belgrade. One can also look at the decision not to have earlier deployment of ground forces in the area or to actually use the Apache to go in with targets in Kosovo itself.
In fact, U.S. officials tell NBC News General Wesley Clark, NATO's supreme commander, complained strongly that it took weeks to get approval to use Apache helicopters. Now they won't even get there for another 2 weeks. By then, Milosevic will have forced most Albanians out of Kosovo.
I worry sometimes when targets are selected by our NATO commander and they are rejected by members of NATO.
And military sources say prime targets have not been hit because of politicians worrying about civilian casualties. Targets like Milosevic's ruling party headquarters, electrical engineering plants, and Serb TV. Field commanders also say politics, not weather, canceled some early bombing runs. Unlike the Gulf War, when Baghdad was hit hard on the very first night.
Although NATO sometimes
says the NATO trying to buy time and split the alliance with the cynical offer of a fake ceasefire. Glenn O'Glaser, Sky News. Refugees, those who get here, are the fortunate few. Conditions in this transit camp are infinitely better than for those still waiting at the border. The sanitation, the shelter and medicine.
I genuinely believe we've made a difference. I think we've saved people's lives. We had the first death here last night of a young baby who's subsequently been buried. We haven't had, though, any more, and I think that's brilliant, and that's what we aim to maintain.
The speed of delivery vital to save lives, if not the capacity. The huge tonnage of food, medicine and equipment destined for this region will still come by mountainous road. The majority of the refugees have been transported far down to other Albanian towns and cities, but 44,000 still sit here in Kukes in the open, waiting for someone to help them. Helicopter evacuation. A number of refugee children, some of them wounded too, were this morning flown to Tirana. The helicopters linking these refugees to the outside world, bringing them both sustenance and hope, are now moving high in the Albanian mountains. Clarence,
all of NATO's demands. The Allies introduce a new weapon. Will take you aboard an airborne battle tank, the Apache helicopter. And eye on a...
Good evening, John. Well, it's a busy night here at Aviano, the third night in a row that the Air War's been operating in top gear.
Waves of warplanes have been taking off from this base in northern Italy ever since dusk. NATO is clearly pressing home the attack, and the pace continues to accelerate as pilots take advantage of improved weather over Serbia and Kosovo. Morale here was boosted by a brief visit of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Shelton. He dropped by to thank the men and women who've been working round the clock.
Sources here tell CBS News that news of Milosevic's ceasefire was greeted on the flight lines with satisfaction. As one officer put it, it's a sure sign we're getting his attention. John?
Tom Fenton in Italy, thanks.
Be able to stop Serb President Milosevic from carrying out the ethnic cleansing of Kosovo, but Milosevic can't stop the bombs. The U.S. and its NATO allies today spurned the Serb offer of a ceasefire.
This offer may be one sign that he's rattled, but we're going to continue to rattle him until he makes an offer that meets our conditions.
Last night's attack set off a massive fireball at an oil refinery, but one bomb fell short, hit an apartment, and killed civilians. Still, satellite photos show plenty of direct hits, and intelligence officers see indications the Serb army in Kosovo is beginning to falter.
We have evidence of units that had to go into holding operations or holding patterns because of shortages of, specifically of gas and ammo.
With good weather and planes from the carrier Roosevelt now joining the battle, NATO should be able to hit more and more stationary targets like this ammo storage depot. But finding and killing the Serb army in the field is a much more difficult task.
We suspect Cuba ready for as many as 20,000 refugees from Kosovo. The White House said today an airlift to Guantanamo will begin within a few days. The refugees will be housed in tents in the fenced-off U.S. enclave at the southern tip of Cuba. It's a long way.
Although there is some help here in Albania tonight, but there's so many more victims and so few resources to help them.
These refugees are eventually moved down the mountain, but there is one left behind. A 10-month-old child who died in Kosovo while the Serbs forced her parents to wait in the rain for 2 days. The tiny corpse is buried in Albania with a simple inscription, a martyr for liberty. Randall Pinkston, CBS News, Kruma, Albania.
Includes the night-flying Apache attack helicopter. 24 of them could be up and running over there in about 2 weeks. Now that you've seen the statistics, see them in action, as CBS's Bob McNamara did today at their home base in Colorado.
This is the raw stuff. For aerial assaults, the Apache helicopter is the Army's main battle tank in the sky. With a crew of 2, a pilot and co-pilot gunner, this war machine delivers an arsenal of weapons, from rockets and 30mm shells to Hellfire laser-guided missiles capable of hitting targets nearly 5 miles away.
It's not designed to be a very speedy helicopter. It's designed to carry a large weapons load, be very maneuverable.
Developed near the end of the Cold War when the Soviet Union still posed the most likely threat to the West, the Apache was designed to be an all-weather, all-terrain anti-tank weapon and saw its first combat in the invasion of Panama and later in the Persian Gulf. This is Fort Carson, Colorado, the largest aviation squadron in the U.S. Army. 16 combat-ready Apaches are based here. Here, after Apache flight crews are paired up, they undergo months of training and battle drills over both desert and mountain terrain. And nighttime exercises will become the most valuable lessons the crews learn.
So that gives you a great advantage at night where the enemy may not be able to see you. You can still see him, acquire him, and engage him.
With all its sophistication, pilots say the Apache can be a high-maintenance machine with large ground support crews needed to keep it flying. And fitted for battle, the Apache price tag is about $14 million each. Bob McNamara, CBS News, Fort Carson, Colorado.
Lost his stealth fighter jet over Serbia last month, but was plucked to safety in a daring rescue operation. In an interview with an Air Force reporter, the unidentified F-117 pilot said, "I knew I was fairly deep into Serbian territory, within 20 miles of Belgrade. Not a happy thought." He remembers intense G-forces as he tried to eject, but can't remember actually pulling the eject handles. "God took my hands and pulled," he said. He parachuted into a field 50 yards from a road and rail intersection and radioed NATO for help. At one point, a Serb search dog came within 30 feet of the culvert where he hid. During the entire 6 hours stuck behind Serb lines, the pilot clutched a cloth American flag he'd been given by a female airman, knowing that it was her way of saying, "I'm giving this to you to give back to me when you get home." It helped me not let go of hope. The pilot says he was prepared for capture, and he says, "I still can't believe that I got on board that rescue vehicle with our guys."
Aircraft carrier to NATO's Kosovo campaign. In addition, several thousand French troops have been trying to help the tens of thousands of Kosovar refugees forced out of the province by Serbian police and military. On whether France would temporarily accept any of the refugees, Chirac said it was not necessary.
Strikes in Belgrade intensify. In Washington, it's the rhetoric that's heating up. A war of words.
Although it has housed 50,000 migrants before, the U.S. naval base at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, will need days to prepare for refugees from Kosovo. The tent city and barracks that sprang up to house Haitian and Cuban refugees in 1994 have been taken down. Gone are latrines, portable showers, expanded medical facilities, and other amenities. Back then, there was a staff of 7,000 assigned to Guantanamo. That has been scaled back to bare bones now, according to the U.S. Southern Command. 1,000
losses of personnel and equipment.
Sighted as targets successfully hit Serb forces in the field, both military and paramilitary, ammunition storage areas, oil refineries, bridges, military headquarters buildings, and barracks. All of this, we are told, must be taking a psychological toll.
When you see your comrades killed in strikes in the middle of the night from afar, I mean, I guess I'm making some analytical assessments here. We do have some evidence, but it is not conducive to keeping your mind totally on the business at hand.
Still, the Pentagon says Yugoslavia's air defense system is still operating and that Belgrade continues to exercise command and control over its forces in Kosovo province. Added to that is another problem. Serb troops are taking advantage of their familiarity with the terrain.
This army is good at using cover, concealment, and deception. And it can take the place of hiding in tree lines and forests and natural terrain.
Then there is the complication of the refugees. With so many ethnic Albanians being forced out of Kosovo, clogging the province's roads, they are apparently interfering with the alliance's ability to go after some Serb targets.
NATO Tuesday added a lot more firepower to its arsenal in the Balkans. The U.S. Navy carrier Theodore Roosevelt Battle Group gives the alliance nearly 50 more combat planes and 4 ships capable of firing cruise missiles against Yugoslav targets. Gene Randall, CNN, the Pentagon.
We get more now on NATO's intensified campaign from 2 correspondents. CNN's Jim Clancy is following the day's events from NATO headquarters in Brussels, Belgium. First, CNN military affairs correspondent Jamie McIntyre joins us from the Pentagon. Jamie, how soon might we see these A-10s and Apache helicopters used?
Well, for the Apaches, it's going to be still a week or so. There is quite a bit of logistics that have to be taken care of to move these tank-killing helicopters. They're essentially airborne tanks down to their positions in Albania, along with the almost 3,000 U.S. troops and tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles that'll be protecting the forces as they operate out of Albania. As for the A-10, which is also known as a tank killer, used in the Persian Gulf War to great success, we may not see these A-10s used against forces in Kosovo, at least not until the air defenses have been neutralized quite a bit more. There's a saying at the...
This is about 50 miles north of Belgrade. These pictures shown evidently